The year is 2024. Soccer is going crazy, football season is back, and the WWE had 72,000 people attend a wrestling match between Roman Reigns and Cody Rhodes. But the UFC is still in the Apex. It was a great innovation during the time of the pandemic, and it was cool to hear knockout-ending shots land with the absence of a large crowd.
The way he's been eating his shots. Oh, we got. Oh,
right hand.
Oh my goodness.
Attacking that lead leg.
Oh, nice right hand there.
Oh, and glove to Sheriff. Oh, nice.
But nowadays, the UFC Apex just kinda seems a little bit soulless. November 9th will be the 100th Fight Night event in the Apex. The facility has also seen 7 UFC pay-per-views, the last of which being Stipe vs Ngannou, 7 Power Slap events, and even a WWE NXT show. The Apex would also be a wrestler's dream, as it is 25 feet wide as opposed to the 30-foot wide octagon seen at literally every other single arena. But it's not just a 5-foot difference. A 25-foot wide octagon has a square footage of 518 feet, whereas the 30-foot octagon has a square footage of 746 feet. It's quite the difference, and the reason is still unclear as to why they chose it this way. Perhaps it was to incentivize action in the fights as everyone is closer. And maybe that is why the octagon has been this way since the inception of Dana White's Contender Series, for more violence. The first Apex event was headlined by Tyron Woodley vs Gilbert Burns back in May 30th, 2020. Crazy because one was coming off of a title fight and the other would be going into a title fight, and now neither are in the top 5. As this guy on Reddit puts it, most Apex main events nowadays are just 2 fat heavyweights, 2 lower ranked women MMA fighters, or some middleweight prospect versus a top 15 guy, and its 100th Fight Night event will be no different. The UFC really wilded out on this card. It's almost reminiscent of the legendary fighters that fought on UFC 300. The last man to make the walk of UFC Apex 100, Neil Magny, has got to be feeling so special that the UFC chose him to headline its 100th event against Carlos Prates, who is riding into this fight on a 10-fight win streak, 9 knockouts in a row, and currently stands at 3-0 in the UFC. If anyone was gonna fraud check someone, it would be Magny though. Neil Magny is basically the perennial contender of the welterweight division, and if you can't beat him, then you'll never reach the upper echelon of the division. For reference, the last 4 people that beat Neil Magny was Shavkat Rakhmonov, who is fighting for the title in December now, Gilbert Burns, Ian Gary, and Michael Morales. 3 of those guys are still undefeated. Out of the last 4 wins Neil Magny has got, his best was probably his Darce submission over Daniel Rodriguez. Basically, the UFC is hoping that this fighting nerd comes in and starches Magny like his previous opponents. That being said, I got Carlos Prates by a 2nd round knockout though. Alright, but the co-main event is actually pretty intriguing to me. The middleweight veteran Gerald Mearshart will be taking on the former 2-division champion of ONE Championship, Reinier de Ridder. RDR was ONE's champion of the middleweight and light heavyweight divisions, which are 205 and 225 pounds over there in Japan. His fight in the UFC will be taking place at 185 pounds. In his last 2 fights with ONE, both of his belts will be taken away from Anatoly Malkin, who was actually a 3-division champion coming down from the heavyweight division. De Ridder is a jiu-jitsu player, and his inverted triangle choke over Vitaly Bigdash in his final title defense is probably his most impressive victory. His stand-up isn't really that good. He's very slow and lacks power, but he does a decent job of hiding his takedown attempts behind punches with relatively good timing. But his wrestling wasn't shown to be extremely dominant at ONE, and I don't think it's going to translate well over into the UFC. But that's why GM3 is a good fight for him. Mearshart is also a fighter who has a grappling heavy style. 11 of his 12 UFC wins are submissions, with the outlier being a body kick TKO. On paper, this fight is really interesting, and we should see some good transitions, scrambles, or crazy submissions due to both of them being high-level black belts. However, in the past, 2 strong grapplers tend to have a stand-up war, so let's see how this one goes down. This is about as close as you will get to cross-promotion with the UFC, as they don't ever like to do these crossover fights with other promotions. So it's going to be interesting to benchmark how good each champion of another promotion is compared to the UFC's roster. I think that RDR should be able to win this by decision, but GM3 has a better gas tank, so who knows. It's like a 50-50 matchup for me. Former GOAT Cody Garbrandt is also on the card.
Look, I never had to chase pussy in my life. On December 30th, I ain't doing it. I don't have to.
What are you talking about?
What are you talking about? We'll see.
Well, I think the viewers see why we separated these two. We have Garbrandt.
And he will be taking on Miles Johns. Cody Garbrandt is the lone fighter of UFC Apex 100 to fight on both historic cards of this year. Garbrandt was really the GOAT of MMA for about 25 minutes and never reached those heights again. I think that he should win this one. His speed and power are going to be too much, but all you need to do is kiss this man on the cheek and he can go to sleep. The chin has looked suspect for years, but Cody did look decent in his 2 wins of 2023 against non-ranked opponents though. Other notable names on the card are Gillian Robertson, Karolina Kowalkiewicz, Mr. Vicious aka Tresean Gore, Ricky Tercios, and Elizeu Zaleski dos Santos, who knocked out Sean Strickland years ago with a spinning heel kick. All in all, I would rank this Apex event as slightly better than the ones that we've become accustomed to, so maybe like a 6 out of 10 for an Apex card. If it was like a pay-per-view complete dog water, get this out of here, man. To commemorate the 100th Fight Night event at the Apex, let's go ahead and present the Mini Machu Apex Awards. The categories will be Best Fight, Best Knockout, Best Submission, and Craziest Overall Moment. Without a doubt, the best fight that took place in the UFC Apex is Dustin Poirier versus Dan Hooker. This fight took place June 27th, 2020, and alternatively to the 2 men that started the Apex shows, Poirier stayed in the top 5, whereas Hooker would fall out of the top 10, drop divisions before fighting his way back into the top 5 in the lightweight division. Today, the 2 are ranked 4th and 6th. This fight was pure guts and all war. Hooker came insanely close to finishing Poirier in the 3rd round, but Poirier survived to the bell, toughed it out, and showed the Hangman what the top of the division was truly made of. The best knockout was difficult to choose from because I was debating between Sean O'Malley versus Eddie Wineland or Cody Garbrandt's buzzer beater against Rafael Assunção, but I don't know how I almost forgot one of the coolest knockouts ever, Apex or not. Yuri Prohaska's spinning elbow over Dominic Reyes is some anime level move, especially with how stoic this man was afterwards, walking away with 0 emotion, insane levels of coolness. I couldn't think of what the best submission in the Apex was. I was thinking of Aljamain Sterling submitting Corey Sandhagen in like a minute, but because Neil Magny is going to be headlining this 100th historic event, let's just put Shavkat submitting Neil Magny. It felt fitting, and the aura behind Shavkat at the time was pretty cool. And for just the general best Apex moment, that probably was one of the more mainstream moments of the sport, unfortunately, was that one John Anik line.
Both of these fighters have dealt with custody battles involving their children. Andre Ewell's son Eli is 7 and as of this broadcast does not have rights to see him, does not know where his son is. Thankfully for Andre.
All in all, I think that the UFC Apex is just a cheap way for the UFC to put on fights. They're planning to invest $20 million into renovations for it, but just why? Why would you do that? The fans make the sport, so why eliminate them? Even if the facility was expanded to include more fans, it just doesn't make sense to have half of the fights that take place in the UFC in Las Vegas at the Apex. It's almost killing the sport in all honesty, and the lackluster cards that the UFC puts on at the Apex contributes a great deal of that and raises fan disappointment. I swear, the UFC even uses this location as a punishment for fighters. Sean Strickland was exclusively an Apex fighter unless the UFC wanted to promote Alex Pereira. That was until Sean Strickland finally earned himself a title shot, and now he's fighting in arenas on a consistent basis. But if Izzy had beaten Sean Strickland at the time, I bet Strickland would be right back in the Apex. It goes like this: if you put on boring fights, you don't want to fight so-and-so, you're a problem behind the scenes, here's a no-name in the Apex for you to fight. That being said, I will still watch the boringly named UFC 100 Magny vs Prates. I just wish the Apex wasn't used as much, especially when it's just a cool place for Dana and his rich buddies to hang out without the annoyance of fans. That was just my little take on UFC Apex 100, as I'm calling it. I don't even think that's the official name, but it's my name, so. The main and co-main event are really interesting to me, and I definitely think that they're worth watching. And maybe even the Cody Garbrandt fight, because he's going to get a KO or he's going to get knocked out. Some interesting fighters sprinkled throughout the card, but not a lot of interesting matchups that stand out on paper to me. I'll still be there, and I hope to see you at the fights. So, peace out. Make sure you left hook that subscribe button.